Hey everyone, my name is Paul Vacheski. I'll be your instructor for Chapter 5 of Arlene Geschwinder's Principles and Practice book. So in this chapter, Chapter 5, we're talking about estates, interests, deeds, and title. A lot of terminology in this chapter. And it all starts on page 69, so if you would please turn to page 69, and we're going to, right away on page 69, there's the key terms. Please don't forget, those key terms are so important to know. You have to know the definition and what they are, so as we go through the course and the individual chapters, we can make them applicable as well. Real quickly on page 69 in the overview section, you really need to highlight that first little paragraph there, and that first paragraph says, an estate in land determines the legally recognized interest the person has in the real property. There are two main types of estates in real estate. Freehold estate and non-freehold estate, also referred to as less than freehold. So a freehold estate, at the bottom of chapter 5 there, you probably need to highlight the first sentence there. A freehold estate means somebody has ownership interest in a piece of land, and it's for an indefinite period of time. Now, freehold means ownership interest. Very important, ownership interest. All right? Now, there are a couple of different types of ownership interests that we have to talk about. The first one is, and in fact, if you turn to page 70, just real quick before we get going, the entire page, these 70 and 71, you might as well highlight and read it about 2,000 or 3,000 times because you're really going to need to know these concepts. So highlight all of that and just make sure that you read it a couple of times so you're familiar. But I'm going to give you a synopsis here. So freehold estate means somebody has ownership interest in that estate. There are three types we're going to talk about. The first one is fee simple absolute, or fee simple. They're used interchangeably. So if you see a test question that says fee simple or fee simple absolute, they mean the same thing. Fee simple absolute means that the owner has those bundle of rights we talked about in chapter 2, which means they can will it, they can sell it, they can lease it out, they can harvest crops, they can mine for gold, whatever. It's their property, they have absolute right. That also means that they have the absolute right to bequeath it, meaning will it, or sell it to somebody because they have free, clear, marketable title. That's what it means. They have the right, the sole right, the absolute right to do it. Now, fee simple, defeasible, and the key word here is defeat, defeasible, means that the owner has ownership interest, but there's something that is preventing fee simple absolute. There are restrictions or conditions to that person's ownership in that piece of property. And the two that we need to know is determinable and condition subsequent. Now, understand, defeat. There's something defeating fee simple absolute. That's what we have to remember here. So the two concepts or the two doctrines we need to know is determinable and to a condition subsequent. And they are on page 70 here, both of them. And you have to know that. So let's take a look at what these two mean. Fee simple determinable. Let me give you an example here. Let's say that I own a piece of property and I'm going to give it to the city of Omaha. And I'm going to give it to the city of Omaha under the condition that it be used as a park, whatever reason. So I'm going to put in the deed portion, and we're going to talk about deeds in a little bit, a restrictive covenant in there, or a deed restriction in the deed when I pass ownership or pass title to the city of Omaha that says, the city of Omaha, once I pass ownership or pass title, you're going to own it, but there is a defeasant, meaning there is a condition to it. So the condition is it must be used as a park. And at the point that the city stops using it as a park, then it's going to revert to this person, Tom Smith, my son, or whoever. We call that a reversionary interest. So fee simple, I own the property fee simple absolute, so that means I can give this property to the city, and I am also allowed to put a condition to that transfer of ownership, and the condition is determinable, meaning that the city has to use it as a park. Now, here's the thing. What happens in 20 years if the city stops using it as a park? What happens? Well, under this legal doctrine, determinable, the property automatically reverts to the remainderman, which is the person that I've established in the deed restriction, saying that if the city stops using it as a park, then the ownership interest then reverts to Tom Smith. All right, it's automatic. The key with determinable is it's automatic. Nothing has to be done. Now, fee simple to a condition subsequent, giving the same scenario under a determinable, the transfer to Tom Smith is automatic. However, condition subsequent says that if the city stops using it as a park, the city still owns it up until a point where the remainderman, the person that has the reversionary interest, Tom Smith, has to actually go and take legal action to get the property back. So they would have to file suit to get the property back. Determinable, it's automatic. Condition subsequent, some type of action must be done by Tom Smith to get that park back so Tom Smith owns it. Now, the type of action that Tom Smith is going to have to take under a condition subsequent will be determined in the deed restriction of the deed. All right, so the last one is a life estate. We're going to have a little bit of fun with life estate. Now, here's what a life estate is. I'll give you an example. Let's say that I own a rental property at 123 Main Street. My mom is elderly, and for whatever reason, tax reason, whatever, for me, it's beneficial I transfer title or transfer ownership to my mom under a life estate. Once I transfer title to my mom owns it. Now, she doesn't have fee simple absolute because there are conditions. She doesn't own it fee simple defeasible because it's much more than just a couple of conditions. A life estate. The life estate is unique in that, because remember, under a fee simple defeasible, it's perpetual until in our scenario, the city of Omaha stops using it as a park. So theoretically, it could go on forever. A life estate, though, the key here is life. So I've transferred title to my mom under a life estate. So that means my mom owns it. She has title to the property, and she has most of the bundle of rights talked about in chapter 2, but it's only for her life, her remaining life. So what's going to happen is when my mom dies, then the property is going to revert to somebody else. The ownership interest is going to revert to somebody else. Okay, so let's look at the top of page 71, a life tenant. What can life tenants do and what can't they do? A life tenant may sell the property, lease the property, or actually take a mortgage out on the property. And some people go, well, how does that happen? Well, I'll explain it here in a bit. They may not waste the property, or means destroy it, and they may not bequeath the property, meaning they may not will it to somebody. So here's our house, and I own it. Paul owns it. That's me, okay? Now, I transfer title to mom under a life estate. That means, listen, title is transferred. She owns it. But that means mom, though, has a life estate, meaning she owns it only for the remaining amount of her life. And once she dies, then the ownership interest is going to go to Tom, whoever Tom may be. Now, Tom is called the remainderman. And you have to know that. And the interest, this legal interest that's transferred, this future interest is what we call it. But we have to give it a legal name, and it's called the reversionary interest. All right? So I own it fee simple absolute. I transfer title to mom. Mom owns the property for the rest of her life. But when I transfer title to mom, at the same time, in that life estate deed, I'm going to put Tom is the remainderman, and the reversionary interest is going to be established in there. So as soon as mom dies, then everything goes to Tom. And I could do whatever. I could say that it goes to the Catholic Church if I wanted. I could say it comes back to me if I wanted to. But in our scenario, we have it set up this way. Now, mom owns it. Mom lives for another 20 years. What can she do? She can actually sell it. So if mom sells it to Sally, Sally now owns the property subject to this life estate. So Sally owns the property up until the point that mom dies. And when mom dies, then the interest, the ownership goes to Tom. All right? So mom could sell it. Sally could sell it. Sally could technically sell it to Tim. Tim owns the property until mom dies. All right? The other thing, they can lease it. So Tim owns the property. He's going to lease it out for a year to Terry. Okay? Tim, let's say Tim found a bank that actually would loan, give a mortgage on it. Now, I know the book says that under a life estate, whoever owns the life estate can get a loan. I think in practicality it would be very difficult to do, but if they could find a bank that would do it or a private equity group that would do it, it would be totally legal. So Tim takes out a mortgage on the property. Here's the thing, as soon as mom dies, Tim loses ownership because it goes to Tom, and then obviously Tim is going to have to pay that off that mortgage. Now, what can't happen is whoever owns this, whether it's mom or she sells it to Sally or Tim, they can't waste the property. They can't burn it down. When I owned this property, fee simple absolute, and I wanted to knock it down just to have a vacant lot, I could legally do that. But under a life estate, mom could not do that. So the other thing is mom can't will it to somebody, because when I transfer title to mom, I put in the remainderment and the future interest, or the reversionary interest. So a lot of things to unpack here. And if you have any questions about the life estate, don't forget to put it down in the comment section so I can answer that question. Under freehold estate, just recapping, freehold estates meaning ownership interest for an indefinite period of time, we have fee simple, or sometimes called fee simple absolute. We have fee simple defeasible, and the life estate. All right, let's move on to the next part of this chapter. All right, the next part of this chapter on page 72 at the bottom, I would like you to highlight the first little paragraph under non-freehold estate. So remember that a freehold estate deals with ownership interest in a piece of property. Non-freehold estate defines the legal interest that somebody has when there's like a landlord-tenant relationship. So very important here. When you own a piece of property, you have two legal rights to it, or you have two legal interests in that property. You have the right of ownership or title, and then you also have the legal right of possession, which is two separate, distinct legal interests. And when we sign a lease, for example, what happens is the owner, me, I have fee simple absolute, so I have a right to lease it. I'm going to sign my legal right of possession over to the tenant for X amount of time, a year, month to month, or whatever it is. I still own it. I have the legal title to the property, but my legal right of possession has been transferred or conveyed to the tenant. Now, everybody, the tenant and the owner, has a legal interest in the real property. And we have to call it something, the legal interest. So, the leasehold interest is the tenant's legal interest in the property, because they do have the legal right of possession and the quiet enjoyment and the things that go along with that. But the owner still owns it, so he has leased fee. So here's how I used to remember this. The landlord receives a fee every month called rent. So the leased fee is the landlord's interest. If the tenant doesn't pay this fee called the rent, then they hold the property hostage. So the leasehold is the tenant's interest in that relationship, and the leased fee is the owner's legal interest in that relationship. All right, so let's turn to page 73 of our book, and we're going to talk about a deed. And a deed can get very confusing for a lot of people. So let's just tackle the deed. What is the deed? So the deed is, as you can see on the board, is proof of ownership, and the deed represents the quality of the owner's estate, meaning the quality of their legal interest. And on page 73, pretty much this entire page, including acknowledgement, you need to highlight. There's a lot of things and terms in there and structurally that you have to know. All right, so in the margin, I need you to write two. We've already did this in a different chapter, but I just want to reiterate here. So in the margin, please write two parties that we have to know. We have the grantor, Grantor. This is the owner of the property, and the grantee. The grantee is the purchaser. Now it's important to remember that this is post-contract but before closing. So once, if the buyer is making an offer on the property, they are the offeror. And we're going to talk about that in a different chapter, I believe 7. That's their legal name, the offeror. Now the person receiving the offer is called the offeree. Again, I'm going to explain this in chapter 7, I believe it is. But once that purchase agreement is accepted, now the owner, their legal name changes. The owner is called the grantor, with an OR on the end, and the purchaser is called the grantee. And that's their legal name all the way up and through closing. And once closing happens, then their legal name changes. Very important, because we're going to talk grantor, grantee a lot. Now look on page 73. It says that the deed gives proof of title, which represents the quality of the estate. Because not everybody has complete, total, absolute, fee simple ownership in a piece of property. All right? So the type of deed, which if you've read ahead in the chapter, you know there's all these different types of deeds. That is what we use to represent the quality of the estate. So, but let's back up here. The deed is going to have all kinds of, the deed is a document. It's a legal document. And it's going to have a bunch of language in it. And we have to know what that language is. And we're going to talk about that. But one thing I want you to understand, this is very important. How do we transfer ownership or title in real estate? There's 3 elements, and only 3 for transferring title in real estate. The grantor, who is the seller, and you have to know that. The grantor is the seller. The grantor executes the deed, meaning they sign their interest over to the grantee. They deliver the signed deed to the grantee, which is the buyer, and then the buyer accepts it. All right, those are the only 3 elements when transfer of title happens. I know a lot of people think, well, yeah, but we got to record it at the courthouse. Yes, you should record it at the courthouse, but it's not compulsory. Whether you record the deed at the courthouse or not doesn't determine whether or not ownership has passed. The only 3 essential elements is the deed is executed by the grantor, it's delivered to the grantee, and the grantee accepts it. Title is passed. All right? All right, we're going to talk more about the deeds in a minute. Acknowledgement. At the bottom of page 73, you really want to highlight the first sentence. An acknowledgement, the grantor, all the grantors, not 1 out of 2 or a majority, all grantors must sign the deed. And for all grantors to sign the deed, the statute of frauds requires that a notary witness the signature and it's stamped with a notary stamp. We call that acknowledgement. That's what an acknowledgement is. In fact, you might just write in the margin there, notary public. We talked about on page 74, delivery and acceptance, but go ahead and feel free to highlight the first sentence under delivery and acceptance. Recording, highlight the first paragraph under recording on page 74. Recording is not compulsory. It doesn't determine whether title has passed or not, okay? But we should record the deed at the courthouse because in the margin there's a term called constructive notice. Very important. When we record any document, whether it's a deed, whether it's a DD 214 or whatever, we're giving what's called constructive notice to the world of your legal interest in that property. So if somebody else makes claim to it, let's say a foreclosure or foreclosure on a tax deed or anything, it protects your interest. They have to notify you before they can proceed with a foreclosure or whatever the case may be. It's called constructive notice. We give constructive notice to the world of your legal interest in that property. All right? Now, what must be in a deed? Very important. All right, let's turn to page 75, a deed, which is proof of ownership and represents the quality of the estate. There has to be 7 essential elements in a deed for that deed to be valid and legally enforceable. Quite frankly, for title to pass. Let's look at page 75, 1 through 7, under contents. You need to highlight these because you have to know them. But I want to go through each one. The first one, competent parties, very important. Now, competent parties mean that the buyer and the seller, the grantor, the grantee, has the legal capacity to actually sign the deed or receive the deed. All right? Typically, competency deals with minors, for example. Are they able to contract, for example? Have they reached the age where they can contract in a specific state? Are they legally declared incompetent, maybe because medically they're declared insane, those type of things, all right? The parties must be competent to execute and receive the document. Number 2, consideration. Consideration is kind of fun because consideration means just something of value. Typically it's money. That's most of the time when we have a real estate transaction, we're transferring money, but it can be something outside of money. It could be a big pile of dirt. It could be diamonds or gold. It could be a deck of cards. It can be the love and affection of a son or daughter. Maybe dad buys a house for the daughter and gives it to her. That's consideration. It's called love and affection. It has to be legal though. 10 pounds of cocaine would not be legal consideration. The next thing is words of conveyance. Now, conveyance in real estate means transfer. We have to have those words written into the deed, and as if you could see there on page 73, we call that the granting clause. Granting clause. We're granting the transfer of title. Number 4, legal description. Now, there's 2 types of addresses to a piece of property generally. All right, legal description. Now, most of us are familiar with the postal address, 123 Main Street, right? That's the postal address. That may or may not be in a deed or in a real estate contract, but the legal description, like we talked about in chapter 3, must be in there. In town, typically what we see is something like this. It'll say Lot 1, Block 5 of the subdivision. So it's a Piedmont subdivision. That is the legal description, okay? If it's a raw piece of land, it's farm ground, it could be a couple paragraphs long. And the bigger the piece of property, the bigger and longer the legal description. But the legal description must be evident in all deeds. Number 5, deed restrictions. All right? Now, think about this. What are deed restrictions? What are some examples? A life estate, for example, is a deed restriction. Fee simple defeasible, where I'm giving the property over to the city, that is a deed restriction. Covenants are a deed restriction. Homeowners association rules are a deed restriction. Those type of things. As I mentioned, I believe in one of the chapters previously, I seen an abstract of a farm in Iowa one time where in like 1920, title was passing to the son, mom was transferring it to a son, and written in there that said that if the son ever married someone from the Jones family or the Mayer family, I don't remember what it was, anyways, then the property would revert to the Catholic Church. That is legal in many states. Now, deed restrictions, when we're talking about things like that, can't violate any federal state law. So for example, it can't be racial. So you couldn't say that if you try to sell the property to an African American, then it's going to revert to the church. That would be discrimination. But there are legal discrimination, things that are legal discrimination that you could do. For example, I seen an abstract one time that said that the property can never be owned by anybody that is an active smoker. That would be perfectly okay to do. All right, so the deed restriction. Number 6, what we call, look at number 6, there's in blueprint there, habendum clause. This represents the quality of the legal interest. How much interest do you have? Maybe you have a little bit of interest. Maybe you have fee simple absolute. Give you an example. Anybody that's ever purchased property from a railroad knows that the railroad gives you what's called a quit-claim deed. And we're going to talk about deeds in a minute, but a quit-claim deed simply says that we're the railroad, we think we might own it, we don't know for sure, and in fact we might not own it at all, but if we do, and whatever legal interest we do have, you can have. That's what it is. A warranty deed would say, I absolutely own this property, I have the entire bundle of rights, and here you go. So it represents the quality of the estate. And the last one is, so I'm going to put quality of estate. And then the seventh one is signatures. Now, in the margin there, what I need you to do is write this in here because it's so important. All grantors must sign the deed. Not 1 out of 5 or 1 out of 2, not just the husband or just the wife. All grantors must sign it. Now, if the property is owned by an LLC, it's owned by a corporation, then what's going to happen is we need to dive into the operating agreement or the articles of incorporation to find out who has the signator authority. A lot of LLCs, for example, will say one person, one principal can sign on behalf of everybody, which is fine. But if it doesn't have that language in there appointing a signator authority to somebody, then all the principal members of that LLC, including their spouses, have to sign it. So one time in my career, I seen where 94 people had to sign a deed. It was an estate. The gentleman was over 100 years old. He had 11 kids. There were great-grandkids. There were spouses and ex-spouses, the grandkids and great-grandkids. It was a mess. So all grantors must sign the deed. Those are your 7 essential elements of a deed. Now, if you look at page 76, here's an example of a warranty deed. And then 77 through 78, just read through there. We pretty much already talked about all of this, so I just recapped those pages. All right, let's go on to types of deeds. All right, we're on page 78, 79. We're going to be discussing types of deeds. Now remember, the deed is proof of ownership and it represents the quality of the estate, meaning how much legal interest do you have in this piece of property. That is determined by the type of deed that is used. Remember, the grantor, who's the seller, is going to sign the deed over to the grantee, and depending on the type of deed that grantor signs, that's the type of interest that's going to be passed to the grantee. So it does matter from a grantee perspective what type of deed we get. So we're going to know, I'm going to explain a few of them here. I'm not going to go over every one of them. You still have to know each one of them. If you have a question about a specific one, put it down in the comment section, and I will clarify any issues that you have. But I want to talk about the general warranty deed, or also known as just warranty deed. That's the most common that we see in most real estate transactions. It provides a lot of things. And look at page 79, those 6 things. The biggest thing that it does is it provides indemnification. It provides indemnification from loss to the grantee. So let me explain what that means. Let's say that this piece of property that the seller is selling was first land patented in 1857, and now it's 2020. And the grantor or the owner is selling the property. I buy the piece of property. Now, what I'm going to do as a buyer or the grantee, I want to have what's called a title search done. T-I-T-L-E, a title search. Some states will do what we call an abstract, depending on if you're a deed state. Both, what happens is, it's basically what happens is a title search or an abstract is a history report of ownership. So they're going to go all the way back to 1857. What kind of issues or what kind of title issues, ownership issues popped up? Were there liens against the property? Were the property liens removed at some point? Those type of things. So it's just a history report of the ownership and all the different players. All right. Now, what's going to happen is, let's say that I buy the house and then in 2022, I go to refinance or I go to sell or whatever. Or I get something in the mail saying, hey, if you don't pay this bill, this lien that was attached against the property, we're going to foreclose and force the sale. So let's say that in 2018, there was some type of lien against the property that was missed. Title passed to me, I'm the new owner, but the grantor used a warranty deed or a general warranty deed. I'm going to go back. I have to pay it because I'm the owner, I'm responsible, but I'm going to go back to the owner that I bought it from and say, listen, this popped up and you need to indemnify me. The good thing now in real estate, most of the time we have things like called title insurance where if this were to happen, there is some insurance policies there to protect it. But it used to be more so now, but it used to be the deed was very, very, very important. It's still important, but if we have title search done or an abstract and we have a title insurance policy issued, it does minimize or mitigate some of that risk. Let's say that the lien goes back to 1900 for some reason. I can't think of a reason, but let's say a lien from 1900 popped up. They're coming to me in 2022, 122 years later saying, we need the money. The thing is when an owner passes title using a general warranty deed, the indemnification is from the day of closing all the way back to when it was first land patented. So it's very important that when we're doing a real estate transaction, the buyer and the seller both want that title searched, whether it's an abstract or an actual title search itself. And we're going to talk about title searches and abstract, I believe, in Chapter 11 in more detail. But just know a title search or an abstract, we're searching, it's a history report of ownership. That's all it is on that piece of property. Now, this is a warranty deed. There is a second deed called a special warranty deed, and it's on page 79. And by the way, it's probably a good idea under general warranty deed to highlight that whole thing. You just have to know what it is. Same with special warranty deed. Now, a special warranty deed does the same thing. It provides that indemnification, but only for the time that the owner owned it. So let's say that the current owner bought it in 1995 and is selling it in 2020 to me. All right? And in 2022, a lien pops up for $1,000 and it has to be paid. Well, if the lien was filed during the previous owner's time of ownership, that owner is responsible to indemnify me or pay me back. Okay? But let's say it happened 20 years before the owner purchased the property. Well, because it's a special warranty deed, I would be responsible for it because the indemnification under a special warranty deed is only valid through the previous owner's time of ownership. We see a lot of special warranty deeds on bank foreclosures where the bank says we're only going to provide a special warranty deed. Now keep this in mind that from a grantee, the buyer point of view, a general warranty deed is absolutely the best. From a seller's point of view, a special warranty deed is better than giving a warranty deed. And in fact, another deed that we're going to talk about is called a quitclaim deed. I'd already previously mentioned it. From the absolute risk management perspective, the best deed that the seller could give is a quitclaim deed. The problem with the quitclaim deed typically, though, is the grantee cannot secure financing based on the quitclaim deed. But it is, if it's a cash deal, it theoretically could happen. Now, that's why we have title insurance and abstracts to search that ownership history to find out which is better. Now, understand this too real quick when it comes to deeds. The buyer and the seller, the grantor and the grantee, they can negotiate what type of deed that's going to be used. And just about every real estate contract purchase agreement that I've ever seen, the buyer is going to typically ask for a warranty deed, and typically the seller says great. But a seller could say special warranty deed. I actually sold a rental property one time using a special warranty deed. Go to page 80, bargain and sale deed. You have to know what it is. We're not going to talk about it. I want to talk about the quitclaim deed. And you want to highlight that whole little paragraph on 80. And notice what it says in the margin. It says, no warranties given by the grantor. That means no indemnification is given by the seller. The seller is simply saying, I think I own ownership, I don't know, but whatever ownership I do have, you can have, no guarantees, there you go. Quit claim deeds are often used in divorce situations where one spouse via the divorce gets title to the property. The other spouse is going to sign a quit claim deed over to the new spouse. And to be quite honest with you, one of the things that does happen a lot of the times, that fails to be done in the divorce proceeding. And when you're the agent and you're trying to sell a house, the first thing that pops up is, hey, no quit claim deed was done. So if your seller it's a divorce situation, please make sure you ask whether or not the quit claim deed was signed by the other spouse. Deed of trust on page 80, you have to know what it is, highlight that, but we're going to talk about that in chapter 11. And then you can go through all the other ones. And you have to know what they are, so please read through them, but for time purposes, we're not. If you have a specific question about one of the deeds that we don't cover, please ask it down in the comments, and I will clarify it for you. All right, let's move on to the next section of chapter 5. So let's describe what taking title actually means here. So we have a couple of variations. The book is full of them. Joint tenancy, what rights of survivorship, tenants in common, severalty, community, those type of things. So what that means is when you're accepting ownership to a piece of property, we're also designating how we own that property. So if we die, that determines our interest. What happens to our interest when we die? And a lot of it has to do with how we take title, and I'll explain. The first one we're going to talk about, in fact, it's on page 84. Joint tenancy, or also known as rights of survivorship. So if you see a test question that says joint tenancy or joint tenants or rights of survivorship, they mean the same thing. Sometimes it's called joint tenancy with rights of survivorship, all meaning the same thing. Joint tenancy means there's two or more people that are going to take title in joint tenancy. Joint tenancy means that when one party dies, then their interest automatically reverts to the other owners, the other joint tenants. Meaning, if I die, so me and you, we buy a house together and we own the property with joint tenancy, and I die, my legal interest transfers to you automatically. My interest is not, I can't will it to anybody because we've taken title in joint tenancy. All right? So look at page 84 and highlight the first paragraph and then 1 through 4. This is important. For joint tenancy to be established, these 4 elements must occur. Number 1, time. Their interests must be acquired at the same time. So if you and I are buying a piece of property, both of our names are going to be on the purchase contract, so therefore we've acquired ownership at the same time. Now, what happens if I've owned the property already, 5 years later I get married? My wife now has a marital interest in the property, but she is not a joint tenant. However, there are some exceptions to that. Let's say we refinance the property together after we're married. We would then be allowed to establish joint tenancy. The thing to remember, though, without something like that happening, I can't just automatically put my wife on as a joint tenant, because number 1 says the interest must be acquired at the same time. Does that make sense? I'll explain a little bit more. Number 2, title means ownership. All joint tenants must receive their interest through a single deed, right? So it's not 2 separate deeds. There's only one. When we received interest, we received it through one deed, i.e. you and I, we put an offer in, and the grantor transferred title to you and I at the same time using one deed. Interest. The rights of the owners must be equal. And it's equal to the whole, meaning this half of the house is the wife's, this half of the house is the husband's. I have just as much right to my wife's bathroom as she has to mine. That's what it means. And by the way, understand this, most of the time, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship is for married couples, but it doesn't have to be. two brothers, a brother and a sister, me and you, we could actually purchase a business or a house or anything in joint tenancy. It's typically established, or it's typically utilized by married couples, but it doesn't have to be. And then possession. All owners have an equal right to possession of the property. So let me illustrate how this works. We buy, let's say there are two people, and I'm a big cartoon fan. So let's say that we have Roadrunner and Coyote, and they buy a house in the desert, and it's joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. And Coyote falls off the cliff and dies. Now remember, they each own 50%. That's the other thing that you must know about joint tenancy. The ownership interests have to be equal. All right? So in this case, it's 50-50. So they have equal ownership. Coyote dies, that means that his 50% ownership reverts to Roadrunner, who now owns 100%. And when somebody owns something 100%, we call that severalty. We'll talk about that in a minute, but now Roadrunner owns the property in severalty. Let's do another one here. Let's say that Roadrunner, Coyote, and Bugs Bunny all buy the property. Now each one owns 1/3. Remember, the ownership has to be equal here. So Roadrunner owns 1/3 of the house and property, Bugs Bunny owns 1/3, and Coyote owns 1/3, and it's joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. All right, so Coyote falls off the cliff and dies. So his interest reverts to these two. Now remember, Coyote owns this joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. He cannot will his interest, his ownership, to anybody else because it's joint tenancy. So now Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny own this house 50-50, 50%. They each own half. All right? So let's say that Roadrunner is finally caught by Sylvester, or Coyote's grandkid, and dies. So Roadrunner, his interest or her interest gets transferred to Bugs Bunny, who now owns it 100%. And when somebody owns something 100%, we call that severalty. Severalty. All right, this is a question that I get. What if, in another scenario here, well, let's use the same scenario. We have Roadrunner, Bugs Bunny, and Coyote buy this piece of property. So we have Roadrunner, Bugs Bunny, and Coyote. They own this property, joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. Coyote wants to sell. Coyote wants out. Well, what will happen is Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny have to agree to the sale. And if they don't, then Coyote can go into court and seek what's called a partition. And the judge is going to say, great, do it, or whatever the judge is going to do. But let's say Bugs Bunny, now remember, they each own 1/3, and it's joint tenancy with rights of survivorship. So Coyote sells. He's like, I'm out of here. I retire. Tired of running after Roadrunner. And now he sells his interest to Elmer Fudd. All three of them own it 1/3. All right? But the joint tenancy has been broken. It's been broken. So joint tenancy still exists between Roadrunner and Bugs Bunny. But the relationship between Roadrunner, Bugs Bunny, and Elmer Fudd is called tenants in common. Tenants in common. I'll talk about tenants in common a little bit more. So in this case, Elmer Fudd can will his because it's his relationship with these two are tenants in common, he can will his interest over to his heirs or whoever he wants to. All right, so this goes on for 10 years, and Bugs Bunny dies. So Bugs Bunny, his interest reverts to Roadrunner. Roadrunner now owns 2/3. And Elmer Fudd has 1/3. And the relationship between these two is called tenants in common, TIC, tenants in common. And now both parties are eligible, both parties are legally allowed to then pass their ownership interest in this property off to their heirs or do whatever they designate. So that's kind of how the ebb and flow of it all. Let's turn to page 85. Tenants in common, please highlight the entire paragraph there because we need to know this. So when we graph it out, it can look the same way. So let's say that remember Tom and Jerry? Tom and Jerry buy a grocery store and they own it, tenants in common. Now the great thing is, so remember back to joint tenancy on page 84, for joint tenancy to exist, it has to be the time, the title, the possession, all have to be the same, right? Tenants in common isn't like that. So it could look like joint tenancy, but it's not. Let's say Tom, the other thing about joint tenancy that's awesome is there doesn't have to be equal ownership. There can be, but it's not required. So let's say Tom owns 3/4 and Jerry owns 1/4. So he owns 75% of the grocery store, Jerry owns 25%. It's tenants in common, so both sides are able to sell, they're able to bequeath their interest to their heirs or whatever the case may be. So if Jerry dies, his interest does not go to Tom like it would under the joint tenancy doctrine. His interest is going to go to whoever, let's say Sally. Now, Sally owns 1/4 and Tom still owns 3/4. That's how tenants in common work. Again, in a scenario where I own the house and then 5 years later I get married, my wife has a marital interest in the property, but our ownership interest is tenants in common. And then the statute's going to say by what percentage she holds, because each state is different. And you don't need to know that for a test. I'm just saying that for illustrative purposes. So tenants in common. Tenants by the entirety, highlight the first sentence. Really the only thing you need to know about tenancy by the entirety is only a husband and wife, and now with same-sex marriage, 2 spouses can hold something in that doctrine, and not every state recognizes that. Severalty ownership, highlight the first sentence there on page 86. Severalty, I don't know how they came up with this, but severalty means single ownership. So if you're a single person and you go buy a piece of property, you own it severalty. Community property, highlight the first sentence there. Again, 9 or 10 states, I believe, currently have a community property ownership, and this is exclusively for married people, whether they're husband and wife or they're same-sex marriage. Partition, we already talked about a partition. Partnerships, we're going to actually talk about that in a different chapter. So, all right, that's all we have for chapter 5. Now, if you have any questions, comments, or anything, please put them down in the comment section, and I will clarify any question or issue that you have. Other than that, thanks for joining us. Let's move on to chapter 6.